Hi, welcome to Out of Psych, Out of Sound, the podcast for A-level psychology students. In today's episode, I'd like to talk to you about ecological validity because it's probably one of the first evaluation points that students like to grasp. However, they often don't take their argument of it far enough, in my experience. So I'd like to hopefully use this episode to explain what I mean by that. Ecological validity is a type of external validity because it looks at various contexts beyond those of the initial study. That's all external means. It's the extent to which the research setting or environment represents other settings or environments. So if you're looking at ecological validity, you're considering whether the findings and conclusions can be generalized beyond the research environment, so the place that the study was originally conducted in. Just a side point, it's important that when you're talking about ecological validity, you emphasize it's about whether the findings or conclusions can be generalized to other environments and settings. Don't just say the study in general. Now, normally when talking about ecological validity, students tend to keep their argument pretty simple. And it's lab environments create low ecological validity, field environments create a high level of it. That tends to be the argument. And the principle behind, their point of argument is that field environments are real life settings with hopefully a reduced risk of demand characteristics. So participants will be displaying patterns of real life behaviour. And because lab environments are incredibly well controlled, because they're trying to boost internal validity and establish cause and effect, and they're trying their hardest to standardise procedures to enable a level of reliability, they often lose out on ecological validity. That drops and they become too clinical, no longer represent real life settings. So that's the standard response that most students will give if they're asked to explore ecological validity. But let me interject, there are studies conducted in laboratory environments where the findings can still, or at least you can argue, that they can be generalised beyond the research setting. So Loftus and Palmer, Milgram, Bandura, Ainsworth and Bell, to name a few that you may have heard of. Results and conclusions drawn from these studies have been observed in the field on numerous occasions. So some people may argue that actually they have high ecological validity still. And to automatically state that a field study, such as a field experiment, will be high in ecological validity, I think, to be honest, is fairly reductionist, because you're making an assumption that complex human behaviour and thoughts and emotions are not affected by that specific environment in any way, shape or form. And when you consider how much time human beings interact in different environments and how their behaviour adapts to the environments they're in, is it honestly reasonable to assume the setting will not have affected them? And it's okay to generalise from one environment, even if it's a real life one, to another environment, another real life one? No, not really. After all, I would behave differently, I reckon, anyway, if I was in a meeting with a boss compared to if I was in a restaurant with my friends, compared to if I was talking to a complete stranger on a train. The ambience and the atmosphere, the distractions and the environmental cues are all going to impact upon how much I relax into myself and the situation, if that makes sense. And one student may have a really good argument for saying a study has high ecological validity, even if it's a laboratory-based study like a lab experiment. And if they've explored their reasoning and it seems plausible that, that study may actually, even though it's laboratory-based, it may still have high ecological validity, that's fine. I mentioned a moment ago that Loftus and Palmer, is a piece of research that's conducted in a laboratory, yet their results have been seen or similar results and conclusions have been seen in other settings. And that's true. And it's why their research has had such a significant impact upon the criminal justice and legal system, because it works in the real world. But let's try to argue effectively for the research being low in ecological validity, because after all, if a student comes across a laboratory-based piece of research, that's probably the route they're going to go down. Just having a quick sip of tea. So if we do take Loftus and Palmer's study on eyewitness testimony, which is our example, and when I'm saying Loftus and Palmer's study on eyewitness testimony, I'm referring to the one that looks at the use of leading questions when students were watching, or after students had seen clips from, start again, after students had to get my words in the right order. So it's a study on leading questions, and it involves students watching clips, watching footage of car crashes. That's what I was trying to say. Anyway, in that piece of research, the participants, the students, were focused on watching a video. You know, that's what they're doing. Look at that little scene. Focus your eyes on that area. Does that happen in the real world? When we're walking down the street and our eyes are gazing all over the place, minds wandering? They knew it wasn't a real life scenario. They were watching a video, or watching video clips. Their stress levels likely weren't peaking because it wasn't a real life crash that they'd witnessed. You know, the footage from driver safety training videos, there were minimal distractions for them because of the laboratory environment. So things like the lighting would have probably remained consistent throughout. Noise levels will have probably remained consistent throughout for them. Is that what the real world is like? And that's why, if we take Loftus and Palmer's study in particular, their laboratory conditions and setting may not enable the results to be generalised to the real world, and we should therefore question their ecological validity. Not simply because it was in a lab. I've had to explore the reasons, almost like produce a list of the reasons why the results cannot be generalised. And there's no doubt about it that psychology strives for research to be ecologically valid. Human beings don't live, play or work in laboratories, unless you're a scientist. So if we're going to use them to, you know, as one of our research methods to help us collect data, if we're going to use laboratories as a research setting, I should say, to help us collect data, then we need to try and make sure the results can be generalised to other environments, because people, real life human beings, interact in the real world, and they often move between numerous environments and settings on a daily basis. So it's important for research to be ecologically valid, even if it is laboratory based and as super scientific as it can be. It's important for it to be ecologically valid so that we can use it to predict how human beings may react in different environments. So there we have it. That is, in essence, a very brief look at how to argue ecological validity. Thank you for listening.